Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Good morning. I'm Ken Girardin, Research Director at the Empire Center for Public Policy. I'm joined this morning by my colleagues, Bill Hammond, he's our Senior Fellow for Healthcare Policy, and Cam McDonald, Adjunct Fellow and New York State Law Extraordinaire. And the three of us are going to give you our takes on what we saw yesterday from Governor Hochul's Fiscal 25 executive budget presentation. As many of you may have seen last week on E.J. McMahon's excellent webinar, under New York's executive budget process, the governor in January presents his or her proposals for how the state will spend money in the fiscal year beginning April 1. There are some statutorily prescribed processes that follow where there's back and forth with the legislature, and the final deal is hopefully finished by the end of March. So what we saw yesterday was basically the governor's opening offer before she goes into negotiations with the legislature. Before we talk too much about numbers, I'd like to just remark here, and this is just me editorializing, the governor's tone was extremely refreshing. Not only did she have a almost Hugh Carey, like the days of wine and roses are over, but she got into some details. So one of those details was pointing out the fact that New York has the highest in the nation K through 12 spending on a per pupil basis. The most recent data that's posted on empirecenter.org shows that New York schools are spending about 90% more than the national average at $26,000 per student. That's also 30% more than neighboring Massachusetts. And she's laying these things out there because there's an expectation in the legislature that the state is going to give another round of really what could be safely described as budget busting spending increases. What we saw beginning in 2021 when the legislature passed the biggest income tax hike in state history was a real break from past spending increases where the rate of spending increase essentially doubled 3 years in a row. And the governor is now recognizing that. She had a great line where she said, we were spending like there was no tomorrow, but tomorrow always comes. And she also drew a line and said she will not balance the budget this year with tax increases. So those were all refreshing things to hear. You could hear echoes of a lot of things that we at the Empire Center have been saying, not just about top line spending levels, but also about specific programs like school aid and Medicaid. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the numbers. The plan the governor proposed yesterday calls for total spending of $233 billion. That's the all funds figure. We don't pay a great deal of attention to that because a big chunk of that is federal money that comes from Medicaid. The schedule for when that money comes can kind of give the wrong impression about stuff. But looking at where New York's total spending has changed since the last budget before COVID, that is the deal, the fiscal 20 deal that was approved in March 2019, it's a 35% increase. And that's roughly 1.5 times the rate of inflation in that period. We typically look at something called state operating funds. This is more or less the money that New York State has to go out and collect in taxes and fees. So it's a smaller portion of the budget, but it gives a better reflection of what public policy decisions are being made in Albany. And in that figure, the governor proposed a $136 billion spend that is up 4.5% year over year. That's up 33% from where it was immediately before COVID. So you had those 3 years in a row where you had, almost, in the neighborhood of 10% increases in some respects in fiscal 22, 23, 24. And she has now definitely hit the brakes on that. And we will talk a little more about some of those categories within there. But essentially, the state of New York went from a $102 billion state operating funds budget approved in 2019 to now looking at a $136 billion plan for state operating funds. Now, the biggest piece of that budget is the state Medicaid program. That's the joint state and federal program for healthcare for the poor and disabled. Bill Hammond, you are probably New York's #1 Medicaid watchdog. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw in the Medicaid piece of the budget that the governor presented yesterday?
Well, as you say, there was a pretty striking change in tone because during her this is her third budget, so she was in charge in 2022 and 2023, and now she's going into her third cycle. Her first two budgets, especially in the healthcare area, were most notable for how freely she was spending money. She she allowed Medicaid to grow at a double-digit rate. She advocated bonuses for healthcare workers. She authorized big increases in payments to providers. And now this year, she's saying we need to put the brakes on. And she's framing this as those last 2 years we were making up for a decade of non-investment, but you can't expect spending to grow at that rate indefinitely into the future. You could quibble with her explanation of the history there. Medicaid spending actually grew pretty substantially during the decade before she took office, but I think she's right that we can't sustain the level of increases that she allowed during her first two budgets. And so this will be kind of a test of, to what extent does she really control the gas pedal in New York State? Can she said she's going to draw a line on taxes. To what extent can she also draw a line on spending? The two things are related, but one doesn't necessarily determine the other.
One thing that jumped out from her Medicaid presentation was when she acknowledged that the state program seems to have overspent by about $1.5 billion this year. And folks who had been reading your stuff would have seen back in October, you warned this was an indicator. And this also isn't the first time this has happened with the program, is it?
Well, it has a history almost from the beginning of the program of running over budget. Maybe the most infamous example of that happened in 2019 when it was $1.7 billion over budget at that time. The thing is, unlike Governor Hochul, the governor back then, Andrew Cuomo, chose not to make that information public. He didn't mention it in any of his financial plans. He didn't mention it in his budget presentation. No one knew about it until the way he resolved it was by delaying a payment from March until April, from one fiscal year to the next, which on paper made look like the one fiscal year was in balance, but it opened a big hole in the second fiscal year, and didn't reveal that he had done that until May of that year. So the legislature had passed a budget without knowing about this expense, and it instantly created a deficit. So all that's way of leading up to the governor is handling this much better. She's flagging the fact that it's running over budget and putting that on the table for, here's my plan for slowing that down. I was telling someone earlier this morning, it's not like the state doesn't have the cash to cover that expense. It does. And if necessary, it can pull money from other programs. It's not a question of not being able to pay that bill. It's a question of has an obligation to balance the budget. That expenditure is throwing the budget out of balance, and she has to reconcile that in the next budget. A lot of the 1.5 billion turns out to have been this anomalous situation where the governor agreed to advance some money to hospitals who were financially struggling, pending the arrival of some federal aid. They were supposed to pay it back within this fiscal year. It turns out they're not going to do that. They are expecting that money to be paid back in the next fiscal year. So that creates a spike in spending in 2024, and then, this unusual drop in spending in 2025. That makes the numbers look a little crazy, and that is the major driver of the overspending, as according to her account of it. But there's no question that the program as a whole has been growing at a double-digit rate for the past 3 or 4 years, which is about twice as fast as it grew during the previous decade. So, and the thing is, New York already had a very expensive Medicaid program with high enrollment and high costs. So I agree with her that that's not sustainable going forward.
Looking at the next biggest piece of the budget is the school aid that Albany sends to New York school districts. The biggest thing that jumped out to me was, well, two things. First, the governor did not match the proposal that advocates had sought. The advocates had been seeking a number, something in the neighborhood of upwards of $2 billion increase in school aid, which would have, in the current year, school aid's about 35 billion and would have brought it to about 37 billion. The governor proposed a number just shy of $900 million in increase, which is an increase, but to be sure, it's less than the rate of inflation, which is an important distinction from where the legislature had been in the prior 3 years, where they had essentially beat inflation each time and brought New York, frankly, to this unsustainable level. But on top of sort of tapping the brakes on the aid increase, she's also started what will be a very interesting conversation about how some of the state's wealthiest districts are getting considerably more aid than the program, the school aid program was ever considered, was ever planning to give them. The state has had something called the hold harmless provision, which prevents schools from getting less aid year over year. And that, among other things, has been affected by decreasing school enrollment. So you have a number of really wealthy districts in the New York City suburbs where spending is over $35,000 per student, and the state is still picking up an outsized share of that compared to what they would be getting, say, in other states. So we definitely expect a major battle over that. But one thing, and this goes back to the governor's tone, one thing she noted from the podium, not only is New York's per pupil spending the highest in the nation, but she also noted that K-12 enrollment is down something in the neighborhood of 10% over the past decade. That's really unprecedented in the times that I've been watching governors. For a governor to go up there and say, look, the premise of all of this, the help the children, do this for the kids premise of all these school aid conversations, for a governor to go and point out that kind of fundamental change was really striking, and it really felt like she could have been reading from, she could have been reading from some Empire Center material on that front. So
the thing that occurred to me when she was talking about that is that you hear a lot of, it often comes up in conversations about school aid, about the disparity between the resources available to wealthy districts versus less wealthy districts. Well, if you want to address that, you have to stop overpaying the wealthy districts. And that's what she's talking about. She's saying this hold harmless provision is basically sending state aid to districts who are already spending at quite a high level. The problem she's going to run into, I mean, I actually think that the time might be right for some kind of action on that. But the problem she's going to run into is that the districts who would lose out in that scenario are suburban districts. And that's kind of the swing of politics in New York State is, can you hold on to the suburbs? Can Republicans make gains in the suburbs? Can Democrats hold on to what they have in the suburbs? If they follow through on this, and if it blows up as a political issue, it could affect all manner of legislative and even congressional races in the fall. So it'll be interesting to see how the legislative leaders handle this, whether they draw a line and say, all that talk about equity, remember that? We're going to ignore that because it's not politically convenient.
One thing that's
I'm curious, Ken, because I was really surprised that the thing that shall not be named was named, which is the decreasing enrollment. Do we have any rank speculation as to why she's touching that third rail?
My speculation is that the governor is actually trying to rally support to her cause of tapping the brakes. And the way you do that as a governor is you use the bully pulpit and you show New Yorkers the fundamentals. I remember a glimpse of this, not to this level, but a glimpse of this from David Paterson in 2008 when he had this really memorable TV address where he said, he essentially said, look, the bottom has fallen out of the state budget, and we can't afford to be spending the way we were before. Now, he was talking more about the revenue side of things. So, but for the governor to go out there and say, here are the fundamentals, here's the premise. So every time you hear any braying about school aid being cut, or school aid being, anything, any increase less than inflation being a cut, or anything like that, look at these fundamentals. And I'm glad you brought this up, because one of the most surprising things about, I shouldn't say surprising, one of the most distressing things about yesterday wasn't the governor's presentation. It was the response from legislative Republicans who ostensibly are so concerned about the tax burden, the spending levels, the outmigration being driven by the high tax burden, out there attacking the governor for even putting her foot on the brakes and slowing the rate of growth. I think a lot of Republicans showed their true colors and just how uncommitted they are to actually shrinking the size and scope of New York State government. And I hope folks listening today will go and look at what their Republican lawmakers have said in their neck of the woods about this, because it lays bare really just how hollow New York Republicans have become in terms of public policy.
I take your points about like her truth telling. There was an element of truth telling in her address. In the healthcare area, she talked about how we spend more per capita on Medicaid than any state, which is true, which I've tried to hammer home. She also talked about how, at least in the written part of her presentation, she talked about how the ratings, the quality of care that we get for all that money is not great compared to other states. So that's great for her to put that on the table. The disconnect is I didn't hear any proposals in terms of spending or in other policy areas that would do much to move either of those needles. And then even rhetorically, on the one hand, she would say, we spend a lot on Medicaid. On the other hand, she said we underinvested in Medicaid for the decade before I took office. Well, those two things can't be true at the same time. So I do think she was trying. In answer to Cam's previous question, I think she's trying to manage expectations in the legislature. She's trying to highlight the ways in which state spending and budgeting has gone wrong, to, as Ken says, to rally support for a better approach. I guess I'm still waiting to hear the better approach. I mean, really, I think she's positioning herself as, in the context of what's become an all Democratic state, Democrat majorities in both houses, where the attitude about spending has become much more liberal. She's positioning herself as the most responsible Democrat in the room, the one who's most concerned about fiscal discipline. But it's in the context, like I say, of the Senate and Assembly are not in that mode anymore. And so she's not some kind of arch conservative. She's just slightly less progressive than the other two players.
On that note, Ken, you circulated yesterday a chart from the financial plan on the state running up against its debt cap in the next few fiscal years. And it's unfortunate to realize that the debt cap is statutory provision and not something that's actually in the Constitution. So it is within the power of the legislature to change that amount. And that seems disturbing to a taxpayer like me.
There will definitely be pressure on the legislature if the projections hold. One thing that we haven't talked about here is that on the capital spending side of things, there's a lot of borrowing. So for instance, we've heard about this plan to build, I think $160 million in new pools across New York. That's borrowing. The bulk of the New York's economic development spending recently has been borrowing, and it has been adding considerably to the state's debt burden. One thing to watch for will be what the recent increase in interest rates does to the state's out-year debt service costs, because we have a lot of debt that we rolled over at really low rates even during the pandemic, some of them, and then now we're having to borrow at considerably higher rates. And there are statutory limits on the amount of debt that the state can carry and on the amount of debt service the state can pay as a function of personal income. And when we see fiscal 29, so that's the budget that'll be done in March 2028, the state is essentially, the state expects to have the credit card maxed out. And that'll be, that's 39 months from now. So we'll need to keep a very close eye on that. One last bit of spending business in terms of top line stuff that I want to mention, and I encourage anybody to fire away with the questions and answer feature on here if you want us to tackle anything in particular from what we saw. But with the migrant crisis in New York City, the governor is proposing $2.4 billion in spending next year. That's actually almost half of the spending growth that's planned this year. She's calling for that's on top of an extra roughly $1 billion in multi-year appropriations that were made last year. So the state's liability for migrants, essentially the state government's costs for the migrant crisis, is going to be about $3 billion this year. And to put that in context, that's bigger than almost any state agency. That's roughly the amount of money that the state puts in to subsidize SUNY in a excuse me, in a year. It's becoming a very big chunk of change, and there is a big unknown on just how much of these costs the federal government is going to come in and backfill. Reading statements coming from even New York representatives, I'm not optimistic about money coming from the feds anytime soon, because there seems to be a pretty firm line in DC that until New York City repeals its sanctuary city status, that the feds are not going to go and rescue the city from the costs that result from that. With that said, I'd like to turn for a moment to Cam. Cam, we were doing budget stuff. We didn't want to talk policy stuff while we were talking about the budget. Just that's at the Empire Center. We've been critical of governors putting policy in the budget, so we had to get budget stuff out of the way. But I'd like to hear from you a little bit what your take is on the non-budgetary policy that seems to be in the governor's budget proposal.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to track because there's so much of it, but I would highlight a couple of things I've talked about in the past that have been good efforts on her part, like the licensing compact for physicians and nurses, and the types of things that would enable New York practitioners to do telemedicine out of state in other compact states that would be worthwhile, that may reduce medical costs. It's important also, I think, to think in the context, we've talked about this before, of some of these policy initiatives that can bring savings, for instance, with medical costs, bring savings to the state, because the state itself is a commercial actor and a huge employer in the state. So anything that we see that's positive that way can have run-on budget effects. The unfortunate thing is there's good ideas like reducing the pre and post judgment interest rate from the statutory amount of 9%, which is pretty huge and unique to New York, to the Treasury bill rate, which is more in keeping of what is done on the federal level and in
Tell us
most
what that
other
is.
states.
Tell us what that limit is. Explain that for the non-lawyer in the room.
So, except for consumer debt, if you did there is the civil procedure law and rules sets a pre-judgment interest rate or a post-judgment interest rate, so that if there's a lawsuit for some sort of damages, that you can collect an interest rate of 9% from the time of filing the suit to the judgment, or until the time it's paid post-judgment, which is a very high amount. The Treasury bill rate has been very low for a bunch of years. At one point, I had a colleague calculating post-judgment interest at the federal amount a few years ago, and was something like 0.8% or something like that. So, it's the type of thing that would make New York a friendlier place to do business and so on. but the unfortunate thing is that this is the type of thing that will go out of the governor's office in the form of a bill language and then be stricken in in the two-house bill, and we won't see it again, or maybe these types of things will reappear at the last minute in the budget negotiations at the end of at the end of March and not be debated, not be subject to legislative hearings and the type of discussion that would be positive for New Yorkers to hear and see if they're interested.
Yeah, the problem, the way this happens is that under the budget process, the governor has kind of maximum leverage with the legislature when things are linked to the budget. So she knows that, the legislature knows that, all the advocates know that. If you are trying to signal, in the context of Albany, if you're trying to signal that you're taking an issue seriously, you want it in the budget. And so the governor gets caught up in that logic just like anybody else. If she really thinks that licensing should be reformed and she doesn't put it in the budget, no one's going to take it seriously. I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of a knock on the routine process that Albany has for dealing with legislative issues, that you can't rely on that process to generate necessary policy changes. They don't do a good job of holding public hearings and analyzing legislation. And it kind of reinforces itself because when things are piled into the budget, there's less time to give them a lot of thought and analysis because they're part of this huge, complicated bill and they're horse traded for other items. And yeah.
What would we have to pay state lawmakers to get them to engage in more thoughtful bill making? Apparently, $142,000 a year plus benefits is not cutting the mustard.
It's obviously not pay isn't the issue. I think it's culture. It's just not. It's not on anybody's expectation of a member of the assembly or the Senate that they will approach things in a different way. I mean, one symptom of it is that just the number of bills that get introduced when you don't have to put a lot of, so if you were going to have a hearing on every bill, you wouldn't have thousands and thousands of bills introduced. You would, that would constrain things if you were having if you had a requirement that every bill had a hearing before it was passed.
That wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing on the planet, though.
No, I think that would be a much. I sometimes think about, like, we've been a state for a couple hundred years. Pretty much every law that anybody thought was necessary has been passed many times over. In some cases, there's not that much left for the legislature to do, and yet they still find thousands and thousands of bills to introduce. Many of them are completely redundant to something. They tinker with an existing law.
Right.
So
Yeah, I'll just
we could do with a lot
I know we
fewer.
have a question in the question and answer, but I'll just quickly give an interesting one of the many laws. On the same day, a bunch of years ago, the legislature passed a bill giving the specific metes and bounds, the area where the Utica Boilermaker race could serve beer post race, because there was a prohibition on sales of beer on Sunday mornings. And so they did a specific exception for that. And then on the same day, actually changed the Sunday law so they didn't need the boiler to allow beer sales earlier in the day on a Sunday. So they didn't even need to make the special exception for the Utica Boilermaker race.
Right. I'll bring stuff back to budget right now, just for the folks at home to understand. Part of the reason why we're talking so much about policy right now is because policy issues have been what have held up the budget process and had major implications on the budget in recent years. Because essentially, if you have one side that wants a policy and the other side doesn't want to give it, often the other thing on the other side of that conversation is more spending. So the policy heaviness of the budget does have a dollars and cents, a negative dollars and cents effect.
Yeah,
A
the
lot-
governor ends up buying policy choices that she wants by allowing the legislature to spend more than she would like. That's the trade. Yeah.
Often, yes. Now we've got a question here about what the all-in cost of the migrant crisis is. I would say the number that I've been working off of has been the City of New York's estimate. Previously, it was at 12 billion. They have over on a multi-year basis. They have revised it down to $10 billion. I need to see how much of that is realized in the next 2 fiscal years, how much of that includes last year. But order of magnitude numbers, the City of New York is looking at about $10 billion. They have gotten so far $1.5 billion from New York, and they are looking for an additional 2.4 this year. So the state, this is back of the envelope calculation, the state would have picked up roughly 40% of the cost so far as we see it. Obviously, there's some money that's getting reimbursed for city costs. There's some money that the state is paying out in the first instance, but order of magnitude, we're looking at essentially, when all is said and done, the City of New York may end up having paid the equivalent of 3 Tappan Zee bridges or 4 U.S. aircraft carriers. I mean, you laugh, but in the grand scheme of things, it should be measured in terms of things that we're usually comfortable, things that you were usually familiar with government paying for and buying. And in this case, when the crisis is eventually over, we are going to have all of these expenses and money that's gone out the door and nothing to show for it. No new infrastructure, no improved services. It is, this is hopefully a very, hopefully a temporary occurrence, but we are looking at something in the neighborhood there. Thank you again. We appreciate these questions. Fire away on the Q&A feature. One more thing.
The second part of, Ken, I'll just jump in here. The second part of the question was why New Yorkers aren't pushing back more against this expense. And I think it's because there is there's a level of misinformation, misconception out there that there's a constitutional right to shelter in New York. That's not actually true. It's never truly been litigated. The right to shelter is something of a fiction that was made up out of a settlement from a lawsuit filed back in the late 70s. It's part of a consent order entered in the court that the city agreed to provide shelter for the homeless, and the state couldn't be bound by it, but said we'll also support it, and has historically supported the city in its efforts that way. But the issue of what level of care the state needs to provide the needy under the Constitution has never been fully fleshed out in the courts through the Court of Appeals. And in fact, the Court of Appeals has said the legislature needs to define these terms, what they mean by needy, what they mean by levels of care. So I think that New Yorkers accept all this because it's just played out that there's a right to shelter in New York, that it doesn't actually exist per se.
Cam, one of my favorite parts about having you in these conversations is how you help explain the why behind the big numbers in ways that non-lawyers often struggle with. I greatly appreciate that. One other big, this is a crossover between policy and housing, policy and budget. But on the housing front, the governor put forward a much tamer proposal and a much more modest proposal than she did last year. Last year, she'd called for a major uptick in housing development, essentially across the entire state. And she met major resistance in the legislature on that. This year, she put forward a really more modest approach. One of those pieces that struck me as the most interesting was she wants to put strings on a lot of the economic development fund money that state officials pass out, where in order to qualify for a pool of $650 million in grants, many of them being the fund Regional Economic Development Council money, communities will have to be designated as pro-housing communities. I thought that was interesting. That was her reaching more for the carrot than the stick. frankly, the economic development programs should go away on their own. So if 0 communities get qualified as pro-housing communities, I'd have no problem with that. We can put that money towards the debt limit that we're going to hit in the next 3 fiscal years. But that was one thing that jumped out to me. Bill, what other non-Medicaid, non-education, non-housing things jumped out at you in the budget yesterday?
I mean, this is a pretty small thing, but I noticed that, and I don't know the details, but I noticed that she's proposing that Airbnb rentals should be subject to the same taxes as hotel rooms. And I think that'll be, fodder for debate as we find out more about exactly how that would work, who would be included. I know it's a sore point for the hotel industry that you can rent out your apartment and not be subject to the taxes that they're subject to. Also, a lot of these rentals are technically not in compliance with local laws. So maybe the trade-off there could be that you legalize the activity and then subject to taxation.
Cam, what jumped out at you in the budget? Big or small?
I guess what jumped out on to me was really just how incredibly complicated the whole thing is with her 144-page briefing book with, just some of the, just the smallest little policy provisions and so on. And it would seem nice to just get better focused on the things that would actually save us the most money, as opposed to so many different policy proposals and small things. I know that it's maybe the product of the process, but it's a little bit frustrating when you're looking at such huge billion-dollar issues.
I could make a procedural point that technically the budget that she's required to submit on budget day consists of appropriation bills. She also includes a bunch of what are called Article 7 bills that are necessary to make the appropriation bills work ostensibly. Those did not appear. Those were not made public. They were not posted for public review until almost the close of business yesterday. So what we were given instead was briefing books and speeches and Q&As, which were all characterizing what those bills were going to do without giving us the actual concrete information in those bills. And that's a break with, I think that probably started under Cuomo, but I'm old enough to remember when early on the morning of budget day, these big piles of paper would be distributed to the legislators and the press, and that was the budget. And so they could start, instead of listening to the rhetoric around the budget, they could start actually reading the documents. And that I just think so much of yesterday, a lot of it's just basically trying to manage the press. They want the press to write about what they say the budget's going to do rather than what the budget actually does, which may be different.
Well, the next step in the process, the governor has 2 opportunities to amend her presentation over the next 30 days. So we'll be watching to see what happens in those. Often those steps just involve fixing typos. Sometimes you do see new policy proposals pop up in there, but we'll be keeping an eye on those. We'll be watching as the budget hearings begin, when you start to have these agency heads for what's often the only time of the year come in and explain how the state has been spending money over the past fiscal year, how they plan to spend it in the coming year. And then finally in March, we'll see what comes back from the legislature with what are known as their one house budget proposals, which is what really turns up the heat on the backroom negotiations, and then ahead of the April 1 deadline for the budget. So with that, I want to thank you both. Thank Cam, thank Bill for participating here today. Thank you all for joining us and for your questions. And keep an eye on EmpireCenter.org. We'll have a lot to say in the weeks ahead. Bye-bye.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at EmpireCenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.